It is shortly after noon, and I think we can start this exciting program. My name is Oliver Tostmann. I am the Susan Morse Hillis Curator of European Art here at the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, and I welcome all of you. We are going to discuss today Vincent van Gogh's self-portrait, which is one of the most popular paintings in our collection. Our self-portrait is a fascinating piece by Van Gogh. It happens that it was one of the first paintings by Van Gogh coming to the United States, being owned by an American. This man was John Quinn, an eminent collector of modern art, including Vincent van Gogh. He acquired the painting in 1912. It was shown in numerous seminal exhibitions afterwards. It helped introducing Americans to Vincent van Gogh and to modern art broadly over the decades. Some of you might remember that in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there were some doubts about its authenticity. The Wadsworth then undertook a technical investigation. It was, in fact, the first painting in our collection that was X-rayed. And those results, they established the authenticity of the painting. Nowadays, there are no concerns about it any longer. All leading scholars agree that this is a painting by Vincent van Gogh. It has been admired here in Hartford by generations of visitors. It is very often on view at exhibitions outside of Hartford. Just a couple of years ago, it traveled to Detroit to this great exhibition of Van Gogh in the United States. And now it is on view in Boston. It is there part of an exhibition about the so-called Roulin family portraits. The Roulin family played an important role in Van Gogh's life. You will hear more about it. This exhibition is on view until September 7th. And I can only encourage all of you to go to this exhibition and to see it. It is beautiful and it is very important. It is the first time that the Roulin family portraits, and there are quite a few, you will see that in Boston, have been taken together. And this exploration of the dynamics between the Roulin family one side and Van Gogh on the other side is deeply fascinating. As I said, you should not miss this exhibition until September 7th. There's also a beautiful catalog that you could study further. The mastermind behind this exhibition is Dr. Katie Hanson. She is the William and Anne Elfers Curator of European Paintings at the MFA in Boston. And she has arrived there about 10 years ago. Before that, she studied at the University of Wisconsin, followed by Williams College in Massachusetts. And she crowned her academic career by a PhD from City College in New York City. After arriving in Boston 10 years ago, she did an impressive roster of exhibitions, among them the very important one about Monet and Boston, an exhibition about Cézanne, and interestingly to me, an exhibition about drawings from Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele a couple of years ago. We just talked, and she just shared with me that Katie is planning on shows for about Renoir in 2026 and 27, and another show a little bit further out about the portraits by Gogh in 2027 and 28. So please stay abreast about what is going on in Boston, and I'm sure these exhibitions will be splendid and will really help us to understand those artists further. Before passing over to Katie now, I would like to remind everyone that we are displaying here at our museums Monet's masterful Cathedral of Rouen, which is a generous loan from the MFA. For every one of you who had not an opportunity to see this great painting, please come to see it here at the Wadsworth until early September. But for now, I'm asking you, Katie, to please tell us more about this great exhibition and about the role of our self-portrait. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Oliver, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, all of you, for being here this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to share with you an exhibition that was co-conceived and co-organized by the MFA and the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, and that's currently on view here in Boston. The idea for this project came from a conversation between myself and my co-curator, Ninka Becker, who is the curator of Van Gogh paintings in Amsterdam, when she was visiting Boston in June of 2018. And we were looking at these two highlights from the MFA's collection in the gallery and realizing that there had never been an exhibition about Van Gogh and this family that was so important to him. This focused exhibition highlights Van Gogh's tender relationship with postman Joseph Roulin, his wife Augustine, and their three children. It features not only his portraits of them, but also works attending to his thinking about those portraits and to his bonds of friendship with the members of the family. These paintings have become iconic in Boston. They're larger than life on our elevator wrap within the museum, often on the front of the building, sometimes in reproductions on Back Bay Station. So our aim in this exhibition was really to foreground the human story, to look closely, to slow down and feel deeply with these paintings that were made at a pivotal moment in the artist's life and career. We are tremendously grateful to the Wadsworth Atheneum for believing in this project and lending so generously. So, as Oliver mentioned, if you have not yet had a chance to come see the exhibition in Boston, it's on view until September 7th, and you will see what an absolute star the self-portrait is in the exhibition, of which I'll give you an overview now. Um, Hopefully. There we go. Um, the exhibition begins but where we get to meet Vincent van Gogh through the Wadsworth self-portrait, which was made in Paris in late 1887. And at that time, he's already thinking about the possibility of moving south, which he ultimately will do in February of 1888 when he takes the train 15 hours to Arles. But as he's making those plans and making this wonderful self-portrait, he says, "My own fortunes dictate that above all I'm making rapid progress in growing up into a little old man, with wrinkles, with bristly beard, with a number of false teeth. But what does that matter? I have a dirty and difficult occupation, painting. And if I weren't as I am, I wouldn't paint. But being as I am, I often work with pleasure, and I see the possibility glimmering through of making paintings in which there's some youth and freshness, although my own is one of those things I've lost. If I didn't have Theo, it wouldn't be possible for me to do justice to my work. But because I have him, as a friend, I believe that I'll make more progress and that things will run their course. It's my plan to go south for a while as soon as I can, where there's even more color and even more sun. But what I hope to achieve is to paint a good portrait." I love this passage because he's 34 years old and describing himself as growing into a little old man, and that you really see him in this self-portrait looking so critically into the mirror and portraying himself with seriousness, with ambition, and in this very unflinching way. He, as he mentioned in that letter that I quoted at length, had a financial arrangement with his younger brother Theo in exchange exchange for Theo covering all of Van Gogh's costs, food, rent, art supplies. Van Gogh sent his brother most of his artistic output. His brother worked as an art dealer in Paris, so even though Van Gogh's artworks weren't selling at the moment, they believed that in the fullness of time, Theo would recoup his cost through sales of that art. And as I was saying, that unflinching way that he sees himself and portrays himself makes for great art. But you might also imagine it wasn't everyone's cup of tea in terms of how they might want to see themselves portrayed. And he did find it quite difficult to engage sitters to pose for him. But he also saw portraiture, and in that letter saying, "What I hope to achieve is to paint a good portrait." He saw portraiture as a genre in the visual arts that had room for innovation. He believed that innovation had already happened in landscape painting in the art of Monet. So this wonderful opportunity that you have a Monet conversation happening with Oliver there in Hartford, and a Van Gogh conversation happening here thinking about portraiture. But that portraiture really was on the cusp of doing something new, and that Van Gogh really saw himself as wanting to be part of that. For many artists, portraits were lucrative. If you think about somebody like John Singer Sargent, and painted on commission with someone who had expectations the artist needed to meet. Van Gogh primarily was making portraits for his own artistic purposes, so self-portraits could fulfill that goal, but he also really wanted to make more portraits of others. And as he's setting up the yellow house in Arles, it's the one on the corner there with the green door and the green shutters, he's really thinking about this as a long-term place to live, to work, and to welcome guests. And he starts using the ground floor of the yellow house in May of 1888 as a studio, before he had the chance to buy bedroom furniture for the upstairs and actually start living there in September of 1888. So he was still living in temporary lodgings over the summer of 1888. But he's corresponding with his brother, who's funding him, and saying what's going on with the studio. He describes the studio as having a floor of red tiles, white walls and ceilings, rustic chairs, a pale wooden table, and I hope I'll make a decoration of portraits. This will all have a character a la Daumier, and it won't, I dare predict, be commonplace. Now, I'm going to ask you to look for some Daumier lithographs for the studio and some Japanese prints. I really want to make of it an artist's house, but not precious. On the contrary, nothing precious, but everything from the chair to the painting having character. So he doesn't make us a painting of the interior of the studio in the Yellow House, but he describes it so beautifully in his letters that we can start to imagine what it looked like. And the Van Gogh Museum has a blueprint of the Yellow House. So we were able to make in the exhibition the exact square footage of the studio to get a real feeling for the place. But I love to keep in mind that it had white walls and a red tile floor when we start to see where he goes with his portraits that he makes in that interior. The first portrait that he makes of Joseph Roulin, who was 47 years old at the time, is the one in the collection of the MFA Boston. And it was made at the end of July of 1888. So you can see the rustic chair and the rustic table, which isn't pale wood, but green as he paints it, and the blue background, though we know, of course, that the walls were white. So already getting this sense of the artistic license that he takes, seeing someone before him, but then creating something more resonant, more artful through his choice of colors and brushstrokes. He says about the postman, "I'm now working on a portrait of a postman with his dark blue uniform with yellow, a head something like that of Socrates, almost no nose, a high forehead, bold pate, small gray eyes, high color, full cheeks, a big beard, salt and pepper, big ears. The man reasons well and knows many things. His wife gave birth today, and so he's really in a fine feather and glowing with satisfaction. I hope I'll also get to paint the baby born today." So I love thinking about these two men sitting not too far from each other within the artist's studio as Van Gogh begins making this portrait, and that he's so ambitious about portraiture. And we see that kind of firm gaze, the sort of confident pose of, this man glowing with satisfaction over the birth of his third child, and also get a real sense of profound immediacy, not just in that physical proximity we can imagine of the sitter and the artist, but also the lively brushwork. If you, look under the postman's armpit, you can even see a sort of smudge of paint through the back of the chair as though the artist has hit the surface with a rag or his thumb as he's working quickly to capture this person who's posing for him in oil on canvas. And then, also get a real sense for, the kind of awkwardness of the postman who probably hasn't ever posed for a portrait before, sitting and posing for him. The two actually lived on the same street when Van Gogh first moved to Arles in February of 1888. He was staying in a hotel on a street where the Roulin family lived, but Van Gogh never mentioned him at that point. The first time he mentions him is at the end of July of 1888 when he's making his portrait. And we know that they both enjoyed having food and drinks at the cafe near the train station, which was not far from the yellow house that Van Gogh was using as his studio, and that the postman wasn't the kind of mailman who delivers mail door to door. He sorted mail at the train station, and he had time between the arrivals and departures of trains to enjoy food and drinks and good stories and conversations at the cafe. And so they seem to have met there, and a friendship began. And his wife had gone to their hometown of Lambesc to deliver their third child, a baby girl, at her parents' house. So I can also imagine this moment that he might feel a little lonely, in addition to being very proud about the birth of his daughter, that his wife and two sons are not around, so probably more eager for conversation and available for posing for a portrait. And Van Gogh was compensating Joseph Roulin for his time, not in an exchange of cash, but by buying his food and drinks at the cafe. And he spent so much money doing so that he had to sheepishly admit to his brother Theo that he couldn't cover his August rent, and was going to need some more money because he'd spent so much money at the cafe with Roulin. So also getting this sense of this friendship that is starting and sort of going gangbusters, if you will. The cafe's owner later commented that Van Gogh and Roulin were like brothers, that they had some shared features, their reddish brown hair and pale eyes, and then, of course, their frequent companionship. And one of the things that I really love within the exhibition about the loan of the self-portrait from the Wadsworth Athenaeum is that it's the first painting that visitors meet. And so they will have seen Van Gogh's features, and then, as you can see in this installation shot, it's just an iPhone photo of mine, but you can see the proximity to where the MFA's portrait of Roulin is hanging. And so visitors might already um, be seeing a bit of that physical similarity between the two men who would become such dear friends. The day before Van Gogh painted the MFA's Postman, he wrote to his artist friend, Emile Bernard, "Let's talk about Franz Hals. He painted portraits. Nothing, nothing, nothing but that. He did portraits of good citizens with their families. He painted the tipsy drinker, babies in swaddling clothes, the gallant, bon vivant gentleman, mustachioed, booted, and spurred. It's beautiful, like Zola, and healthier and more cheerful, but just as alive, because his epoch was healthier and less sad. Now, what is Rembrandt? The same thing entirely, a painter of portraits." So I love, we have so much access to Van Gogh's thoughts through his letters and knowing that he's thinking about this 17th century Dutch painter, Hals, the day before he has Roulin posing in his studio. And these two Hals portraits are in our exhibition as well and are ones that he mentioned in that letter. He was really enamored of the art of Franz Hals. Like us, he was a great museum goer and liked to read about art as well. And he admired the subtle play of colors in Mary Drinker, for example, that kind of taupey brown and mustardy brown. And then you can see him doing something not so dissimilar in his play of blue on blue and his portrait of the postman, even that kind of open posture of the postman, who was kind of his own Mary Drinker, if you will. Um, he also really admired Franz Hall's bravura brushwork, the way that Hals could just, make a stroke of paint that was so convincingly, a whisker in a beard or, a lip or whatever it was, without having to come back and retouch it. So you can get a sense, I think, of the ways in which he's engaging with portraiture, both with the person in front of him and then in terms of the history of art. He also repeatedly referred to Roulin as looking like a character from a Daumier print. And in that quote I read about how he wanted to decorate the studio, he had asked his brother for Daumier lithographs. Honoré Daumier was, of course, a prolific artist whose caricatures featured in newspapers and as separate sheets, collected by admiring fans then and now, including the Van Gogh brothers. And he didn't specify which one he had in mind, so I went through the inventory of great Daumier prints here at the MFA and found two that I thought had a similar kind of upward tilt of the head, and in both cases convey intoxication, whether by pride over one's portrait or by excess drink. And then we have this wonderful drawing from the LA County Museum that was actually made after the painting rather than before, as sort of is more typical of drawings. But this one was made afterward because Van Gogh kept the painted portrait in Arles, and so he sent the drawing of it to his brother Theo in Paris to let him know what progress he was making in his paintings. And he wrote, "I always feel confidence when doing portraits, knowing that that work is much more serious." Perhaps that's not the word, but rather is the thing that enables me to cultivate what's best and most serious in me. So he begins the MFA's portrait of Roulin on the day that his daughter is born and is immediately intrigued by the possibility of painting the infant and indeed the entire family of five. So here they are, and they're in our sort of second space within the exhibition. It was an artistic goal for him, but it was also a highly personal goal. Van Gogh was at that point 35, and he was coming to grips with the unlikelihood of being a husband and a father himself. And at this time, he writes to his brother, "In life and in painting too, I can't do without something greater than myself, the power to create. And if frustrated in this power physically, we try to create thoughts instead of children. In that way, we're part of humanity all the same. I'd like to paint men and women with that je ne sais quoi of the eternal, of which the halo used to be the symbol, and which we try to achieve through radiance itself, through the vibrancy of our colorations. Ah, the portrait with the model's thoughts and soul. It so much seems to me that it must come." So he took great pride in depicting this entire family and ultimately made a few portraits of every member of the family to the tune of 23 paintings and three drawings of this family of five. Um, and he never showed all five members on one canvas together. He made two double portraits of the mother and infant, but otherwise showed the family members individually across, on separate canvases. I should also say he stopped reimbursing them with food and drinks at the cafe. I think he learned his lesson with how much that cost and ultimately compensated them with art. So the family came to own a portrait of each member of the family. So they had the portrait of 11-year-old Camilla here with the yellow background is the repetition. They had the one from Philadelphia. I forgot. Um, we also have a sort of more standard family portrait in the exhibition. This is one by 17th century Dutch artist Adrian van Ostade from the Louvre that Van Gogh particularly admired and might be what you are thinking of when I say family portrait. But Van Gogh did not ultimately do this. He takes a different approach to portraiture and showed each of them individually and made these are all 26 of them arrayed on the screen now. You can see that the first were made in late July and August. There was a lull, and then most of them were made in November and December of 1888, and then a few into the early part of 1889, about which I'll say more soon. Seeing them all arrayed like this, and this is a page spread from the exhibition catalog, is why it has figure numbers. Um, you may notice some quirky features, particularly with our knowledge that the interior of Van Gogh's studio had white walls. One of the things I love to think about is that he had asked his brother for Japanese prints. So you might notice or you might know about UKOA prints that some of them had these kind of strong, solid color backgrounds. So that might be one of the things that he's thinking about. He also wrote that he was very proud of having had gas lighting installed in the studio so that he could do portraits in the evening. And he talked about the gas lighting as being sort of a orangey yellow glow. And so I kind of think about the coziness of having people in the studio in the evening with the gas lighting, and that he's turning the vibrancy of color way up. It wouldn't have been that yellow in real life, but giving a sense of that cozy, intimate experience by then creating a yellow background. And he, as you can see on the screen, made repetitions of the portraits such that he could give one the one on the bottom, now in Philadelphia's collection and on view here in Boston, to the family. And then he made a repetition of it for himself before he gave the first version to the Roulin family. And so that allowed him to do the same composition, but make some changes. And I love having just read that quote about, the colorations doing what a halo used to do. And you can sort of see the brushstrokes around Camilla's head. Creating something of a radiant halo behind him. And then, conveniently, it meant that he didn't need the same sitter to pose the second time because he could use the painting as his model for making the repetition when he worked again. And so he gave one to the Roulin family and kept the second one for 6 months, perhaps as a decoration for the Yellow House studio, before sending it to his brother in Paris, where it could be seen by critics and artists and potential buyers. And then, as I mentioned, another, potential sort of spark for his imagination on doing that kind of strong yellow background might have been Japanese prints that he admired and collected and displayed in the Yellow House. So, as is often the case with creativity, multiple sparks may be firing in his mind as he's creating these works of art. He dreamt of a communal studio where artists would join together and work, as he said, as family, as brothers and companions. And he realized that aim from late October to late December of 1888 when Paul Gauguin shared his yellow house in Arles. The there were two bedrooms upstairs and then the one shared studio on the ground floor. And it was a really challenging time for both men. Van Gogh was a much more accomplished artist than Gauguin had imagined he would be, and they had very different working practices. Van Gogh preferred to work from a model, whether that was a landscape or a portrait sitter or his shoes, something he could see, and then to sort of innovate and exaggerate his word from there. And Gauguin was kind of constantly needling him to work more from his imagination and abstraction. Um, as you saw on that slide showing all 26 of the Roulin portraits, most of them were painted during the time that Van Gogh and Gauguin were sharing a studio, and sharing a studio, of course, meant sharing models. So on the screen now, you see works that are all of which are in the exhibition, so you can see both artists portraying the same individuals. Gauguin painting Augustin Roulin and Van Gogh painting Augustin Roulin, and then paintings by Van Gogh of baby Marcella and 11-year-old Camille, as well as drawings by Gauguin of those same people. And just a little note about working process, that in the time it took Van Gogh to make a painting, Gauguin would make a drawing of roughly the same size. So really just very different working processes. In addition to the idea of community in terms of sharing a studio and inviting members of the neighborhood to come and pose, Van Gogh also thought about community in terms of lineage and art history. He described himself as a link in a chain of artists, sort of connecting himself to the past, to 17th century Dutch artists he admired, connecting himself to artists far away, like the Japanese printmakers he so admired and collected. And so I like, these are all in the exhibition, sort of seeing the ways that his portraits communicate with that idea of community in terms of lineage. And it was his ambition to make portraits that are at once representations of a specific individual, as a portrait is, but also that could function as a record of a type in the place and time that it was made, as a record for centuries to come. And that's really how he understood and appreciated 17th century Dutch portraits. Seeing this group on the screen, you can really get a sense for the creative amalgamation of observation of his cherished friends and sources of inspiration that he remembers and absorbs and transposes in his mind and through his brush. He referred to this portrait of Augustin Roulin as La Berceuse. The title is on the canvas itself. It's a little hard to see because it's tone on tone, red on red. But he described that painting more than once as looking like a cheap chromolithograph from a penny bazaar. And he liked that idea that it might be appealing to common folks who had more access to, cheap trading cards than they might to art in museums. And so we have some cheap chromolithographs from the 1880s in the exhibition. I can say they're cheap because I own them. So I'm not saying anything bad about someone else's collection. Just that was the way he described it in his letters, and I used my own prints for the exhibition. Um, and then you see this wonderful portrait made by his artist friend Emile Bernard, who he had been writing to about Frans Hals, this portrait of Bernard's grandmother. And Van Gogh praised Emile Bernard, that he'd never been closer to Rembrandt than in that portrait. So this wonderful opportunity to see art by two peers, but in the context of other work that was admired. Um, Another thing I really love about having this Rembrandt, which is newly officially part of the MFA's collection, with the portrait of Augustine, is you can see the serious demeanor and the seated pose, slightly turned to the right, are conventional and they're shared by both artists for their sitters, and that each woman has a real commanding presence. And Van Gogh wrote that it was his desire to express the thought of a forehead through the radiance of the brow. And I really love that you see that in two very different ways in Rembrandt and in Van Gogh. But again, this idea that he's wanting to tell us more than just the physical appearance of someone. He wants to tell us through radiance about the model's thoughts and soul. Um, Sadly, if you know Van Gogh's story, you might also know that this is the time that he cut his ear after a heated disagreement with Gauguin in late December of 1888. And that would bring to an end the dream of a shared studio of the South. He had begun working on the portrait of Augustine Roulin as La Berceuse, of which he would ultimately make 5 versions. And the first one remained unfinished on his easel at the time that he injured himself and went into the hospital. A real revelation for me in working on this project was the depth of care that he received from the Roulin family. It was the postman, Joseph Roulin, who went to the hospital every day to check on Vincent van Gogh, and who wrote to the artist's family to update them on his condition. Vincent's brother was only able to come from Paris for a day to see him, and Gauguin left with Theo and went back to Paris. So it was the postman who kept everyone updated on how Van Gogh was doing, which was pretty desperate at first. And then he did make a marked recovery within a few weeks. And when he was discharged from hospital, it was the postman who spent the day with him at the Yellow House, making sure that he was well and settled. Um, and then, in a truly bittersweet turn of events, the postman, who was very good at his job, got a promotion in late January of 1889, not long after Van Gogh left the hospital. And Roulin was relocated from Arles to Marseille as part of this promotion. And so we have letters between Joseph Roulin and the artist's siblings, and then we have letters between Joseph Roulin and the painter himself when they no longer live in the same town. And all 10 of the known letters written by Joseph Roulin are in our exhibition. Shown together for the first time, which has been really, really exciting. And they're hard for me to talk about without crying. So I'm not going to do it today, but if you come, they're translated in the catalog and in the exhibition, and are a wonderful feature. Um, the family continued to really be on the artist's mind, thanks to letters, but also they were so much a part of his time in Arles. And you can see him, he ultimately makes 5 versions of La Berceuse, um, finishing the first one after he got home from the hospital in January of 1889, quickly making 2 more before inviting the Roulins over to pick the one they wanted to take home. He started work on the fourth before going back into the hospital, and then painted the fifth actually in the hospital in Arles shortly before deciding that he needed to pursue residential care in Saint Remy, just north of Arles, where he would stay for a year from May of 1889 to May of 1890. I love this lineup, which is in the exhibition as well as on screen now, where you can see him working from his imagination, painting a dance hall in Arles in December of 1888. And there's one calm point within that team of revelers in the dance hall, and it is the face of Augustine Roulin, who surely was not there, nor did Van Gogh actually paint this on location, but he imagines her into it. And then a painting he made in in the spring of 1890 when he's in the asylum in San Remi, and he had received for his birthday a group of prints, including The Raising of Lazarus by Rembrandt. And he, the next day, painted this painting where he gave Lazarus his own features and the sister of Lazarus the features of Augustine Roulin, who had visited him in the hospital while he was convalescing, who was someone he admired as a mother and a wife, a really a person whose depth of care and concern was something that really stayed with Van Gogh. So you can see her moving from a portrait sitter to a character within his art, within the exhibition, which I think is a wonderful opportunity. We've included in the exhibition two of the landscape paintings from the MFA Boston collection, along with this idea of seeing him see something before him and then kind of transpose it in his mind. So this idea of combining observation and inspiration. I love this wonderful view from his bedroom window in the asylum in San Remi, which he describes as a field of yellow stubble, which is being plowed in opposition to the purplish plowed earth with strips of yellow stubble, a background of hills. The distant windmill isn't there now, nor was it there in 1889 when he made the painting, but he might have been longing for his Dutch homeland and sort of bringing in things from his imagination to combine with the view that he sees before him, eliminating the stone wall, these kind of changes that he's making by intention in a similar way to how we've seen it throughout the exhibition in terms of his portraits. He was also being invited at this time to contribute paintings to exhibitions in Paris and in Brussels. And this painting of the ravine from Saint Remy was one that he painted in the autumn of 1889 and then sent to Paris to be included in an exhibition there. He described the scene of this ravine near the asylum in Saint Remy, which you can see on photos there, taken by my co-curator and by the journalist Martin Bailey. Um, he says, two bases of extremely solid rocks, between which a trickle of water flows, a third mountain that closes off the ravine. These motifs certainly have a beautiful melancholy, and it's enjoyable to work in really wild sites where you have to bury your easel in the stones so that it doesn't send everything flying to the ground. So again, that idea of trying to imbue meaning, feeling, emotion through the exaggeration of form and color as he's working. Um, this was a painting, as I said, exhibited in Paris in the spring of 1890, where Gauguin saw it and wrote to Van Gogh saying, "In subjects from nature, you are the only one who thinks. The one I'm talking about is a mountain landscape. Two travelers, very small, seem to be climbing there in search of the unknown. It is beautiful and grandiose." So yes, they reconciled, and also gives a sense for the way that Van Gogh's star was on the rise in the final months of his life as his art was being seen by more viewers, and art criticism was starting to be written about him, and more artists were looking at his work. The exhibition ends in the same way that it began, with a self-portrait and a place. These two were both painted in September of 1889 while Van Gogh was in residential care at the asylum in San Remi. And while he was working on this self-portrait, he's reminiscing in his letters about his enduring commitment to portraiture and the intense period of time when he had worked on the Roulin portraits the previous year. And then he's also making a repetition of a painting of his bedroom from the Yellow House in Arles, after he hasn't lived there for months and months and months, but he's making a repetition of that painting. So again, that kind of going in his mind back to this place and time that was so important to him. I think you can really get a sense for the immediacy of the lively brushwork in the self-portrait. The blue garment against the blue background may recall the Wadsworth self-portrait or the MFA's portrait of Joseph Roulin. And again, that idea of a certain kinship that he felt with the russet-haired postman, who he described as isn't exactly old enough to be like a father to me, but who had certain tendernesses for me all the same, which I think is really beautiful. This is less than a year before the end of the artist's life in July of 1890. But the Roulin family lived on and continued to grow, and we have photographic portraits of all five members of the family later in their lives in the final gallery of the exhibition. And you might notice baby Marcel all grown up on the bottom portrait there, and it's hanging side by side with a repetition that Van Gogh made of his portrait of her that he had given the first version to the Roulin family, and this version from the Van Gogh Museum he gave to his brother and sister-in-law when she was pregnant with their one and only child. And she was so pleased when she received this portrait of baby Marcel Roulin that she said she hoped the baby she was carrying would be as healthy and beautiful as the one painted by its uncle. So I think that's quite sweet. And you might notice in the photographic portrait of her as an adult, on her mantelpiece, there are reproductions of the portraits of her parents, the one from the MFA collection being very obvious to see there. Van Gogh maintained a deep commitment to the importance and possibilities of portraiture. He wrote, "The painted portrait remains for many generations. A painted portrait is a thing of feeling made with love or respect for the being represented. What remains to us of the old Dutchman? The portraits." As I close, I would just like to note that these self-portraits in the exhibition are a powerful testimony to how much changed for Van Gogh in his art in just 2 years. The two self-portraits with the blue painter's smock, one from the Wadsworth Athenaeum, the other from National Gallery in Washington, were made exactly 2 years apart, autumn of 1887 and autumn of 1889. Between those two self-portraits was his work on the Roulin portraits, and you can see how much has changed for him in his art over the course of that time and in his personal goal to do portraits which would look like apparitions to people a century later by our passionate expressions, intensification of character, and modern taste for color, in his own words. Through his art, a modest family in Arles was immortalized, and so was the artist, just as he had hoped when he recognized that his contribution to humanity would not be human offspring, but creative ideas expressed on canvas. Van Gogh remained deeply committed to portraiture to the end and knew that these likenesses would outlast us all. They connect him to his own time, to the past, and to the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. This was
It's my pleasure.
wonderful. It is such a great focused show that you curated. And
Thank you.
what I find most striking is that despite or perhaps because of its focus, it really enables us to come very close to the persona of Vincent van Gogh. It's really sort of you learn so much about his personality, and you learn so much about these broad periods of his career and of his artistic learning during those years, that it's really a wonderful moment to get to know him better. I was most surprised to learn or to realize that while he depicted the family members of that were so close to him various times and did repetitions even of some portraits, he never did a group portrait of the family, which is even more fascinating when you think about his indebtedness, about his interest in Dutch portraiture of the 17th century. But I was wondering, Katie, if there's anything particular that you learned about this show that you sort of took away from the show.
Yeah, thank you. Had been the curator here at the MFA for, for years, thinking about these two portraits, which are icons of our collection. They're always on view somewhere, whether it's here in Boston or, on loan to another project. So they're paintings I thought I knew really well. And then I started working on this project and realized how much more there was to learn. And, a huge revelation for me was just, the depth of the friendship between the artist and the family. So reading those letters and really understanding that the postman wasn't just a guy who posed for him. It was one of his best and dearest friends, somebody who really cared for and sustained him. And I found that to be profoundly moving in working on this project. And then, another opportunity that this project afforded was that we actually took the portraits off view from May until September of 2023, and they summered in the conservation studio here at the MFA Boston, not because either one of them needed work done, but because they're always on view somewhere. We hadn't taken the opportunity to look through the microscope, to do new technical imaging, X-rays, infrared, a little bit of physical sampling. And we learned so much about his working process by taking that time to be with the paintings. So for example, one of the things, and the findings from those months are published in the exhibition catalog for members of the conservation team. Wrote a chapter about what we learned. But I'm so often asked, was the portrait of the postman painted, all in one go? Because it does look so fresh and immediate, and that kind of, swipe of paint under, that crosses the back of the chair under his armpit. And we were able to see that there were places in the portrait like that that are wet into wet, so all in one. But there are other places within the portrait that are wet paint over dry, and oil paint takes time to dry. So even if the postman only posed the one time in this way, that Van Gogh worked on the painting in at least two campaigns. So that was really interesting about that one. And then about the portrait of Augustine, as Laber says, we still can't tell for sure what order he made the five versions in. There are as many opinions about the order of the five. Portraits of her as La Berceuse as there are authors writing about it, and we hoped we might find the smoking gun to answer the question, but we didn't. And so that sort of sense that there's still more to learn. And we looked at it with ultraviolet light, and there's a wonderful video about that on the MFA's website and playing here in Boston. But the title, which you can barely see on the screen, was in another pigment, and a pigment that was sensitive to light and has totally faded. So the painting, which is very loud in its color palette now, would have been even bolder, in that the title would have been sort of a pinky orange color on the red, and more visible originally, and that pigment's just gone. So we learned a lot actually, about the physical objects, about the friendship, about the life.
Fascinating, Katie. Are there any questions that you may have for Katie? I think our audience is rather shy or perhaps in awe today. Well, I do have a last question for you, Katie.
Great.
Something that I have or I sometimes think that an artist like Van Gogh, who is so well known, who has been explored in so many exhibitions, is an artist who we might think we know everything about. How does it come that he is still so popular and that there are still exhibitions like yours that are really sort of changing our perspective on him? Do you have any explanation why the public and why we are still so spellbound by this artist?
Oh gosh. I mean, in part, we owe a huge debt to his sister-in-law, Johanna van Gogh, who was pregnant with the baby and received that portrait of Marcel. Because when Van Gogh died, his brother had a huge inventory of his paintings, and he died 6 months later. And so it was his widow, Johanna, who worked diligently and strategically to place Van Gogh's art in exhibitions and to make sales to collections, to really afford the possibility of his art being seen and appreciated and studied. And so the worldwide appreciation of Van Gogh is in part because his works are spread around the world. And I think, so there's that side of it. And then I think also there's something so vulnerable about the way he shared his story in his letters and the way that we can, if we let ourselves really feel to come closer to him as a person and his triumphs and his struggles by reading those letters and then looking again at the art, and that there's just something um, I think that that keeps us coming back for more, in that the works of art themselves are so rich and varied in their brushstrokes and their evocativeness in terms of emotion, and then that he, bared his soul so much in his letters, which his family kept and shared, so that we can really feel like we're coming closer to him as a person in being with his art and with his letters. So yeah, these, it's scary taking on a project that is so focused. It's a Roulin portrait or it's not. And so doing such a focused show is a particular kind of undertaking, but I do think, it can have the merit of allowing us to really be with him in a particular ambition, a particular moment that can be a revelation, as this project at least has been for me.
Thank you again, Katie.
Yeah.
I received here in the meantime many thank yous,
Oh,
many thank yous
thanks.
for you, Katie. Um, and there are also among them a few questions. One question is from Catherine. What info did you find about the Wadsworth self-portrait? Um, is there anything new that you found out about the self-portrait, Katie?
Yeah, I think, for me, I was, really standing on the on the shoulders of giants in there, having been that wonderful exhibition of Van Gogh's self-portraits at the Courtauld just a few years ago. So there was already great, research in depth about your particular self-portrait. And then it was just absolutely a curatorial dream for me, one that I still pinch myself that I was able to make come true, to be able to begin and end the exhibition with the man himself. And I can tell you all day long how much changed for him in those 2 years, but I think visitors can really see it for themselves in being able to see
Mhm.
the Wadsworth self-portrait and the National Gallery self-portrait, which formally have a lot in common in their pose, in their color palette, etc., but also have, are so starkly different in the application of paint, in the evocativeness of emotion. And so for me, it was really a way of being with him in this ambition as a portraitist, to be able to see him see himself at these intervals in the project.
Um, and as a last, thank you. As a last question, I would like to pass on this question from Carol, who asks about how these pictures of the Roulin family reflect his own family dynamics. Could you say a little bit about this aspect, please?
Yeah, yeah. was a bit estranged from his mom at this moment. And so I think there's an extra sort of depth to his admiration for Augustine Roulin as a mother and a wife. And, we know that he describes the flowers behind her in the painting that's on screen now as chrysanthemums, a flower he associated with his own mother. So he does seem to be sort of exercising some of his own family dynamics in making portraits of a family that he's getting to know. And the Roulin family in addition to him inviting them to his studio to pose, they invited him to their home to dine with them. So they, made him part of their community. But I also think important to keep in mind that Joseph Roulin is 47, his wife is 37, and Van Gogh himself is 35. So they're really peers in terms of age for him. He sort of looks up to the postman. He says, not old enough to be a father figure to me, but he does sort of see him as a mentor. He goes to them for advice on where to get home furnishings, how much he should expect to pay when he's furnishing the yellow house, which he rented unfurnished. And so it is both family dynamics, but also that wonderful depth of friendship. I mean, I know having moved to Boston 10 years ago, knowing no one in Boston, that there were some friends I made really quickly. And I wonder about, other folks, having had experiences like that of being new somewhere, whether it's new at work or new in town, and that depth and bond of friendship that you might build over time or that you might find happens so quickly. And I loved reflecting on that for Van Gogh as well. I think he's somebody that is often um, mythologized, often sort of thought about in legend as this, really isolated loner, melancholy figure. And so knowing that he did have some, really great deep friendships with other artists, but also with community members like the Roulin family, I think is wonderful about seeing these portraits. I should say one of the most charming for me anyway, moments in the letters that the postman writes to Vincent himself. He had to relocate to Marseille before his family could come with him. So he was separated from his wife and children. And he says to Vincent in a letter, but thanks to you, Marcel can wave good morning and good night to me because my portrait hangs in the alcove where she sleeps. So also this sort of sensibility of how they lived with his art and enjoyed his art, I thought was so charming about getting to know their friendship more.
Thank you, Katie. It's always so rewarding to be reminded about the humanity
Yeah,
of great artists and
that's
their
right.
relationships to friends. Thank you so much for this fantastic talk.
Oh, my pleasure.
Congratulations to your wonderful show. I hope many of us here from Hartford will now make a trip to Boston to
Please
see
do.
it. And we now have to close this. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. But again, this was fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie. Bye bye.
Thank you. My pleasure.